right. Thank you guys. For anyone who may have missed the introduction, I'm Linda Midgett. I'm the executive producer at Louisiana Public Broadcasting. And you've just watched 8 Days at Ware, which is part of the Real South documentary anthology series. We are in our 7th season. And we are really pleased that this film is part of this season. So it is my honor to introduce you to the two filmmakers, the directors of this film, and I'd like for them to join us on camera now. Welcome. We have Meg Schutzer and Rachel Lauren Mueller. Welcome, Meg and Rachel.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yep, thanks for having us.
So I want to start by congratulating you both on directing such a powerful and moving film. I've seen it several times, and it just really breaks your heart seeing what Solon went through and what the other children have gone through. And so I want to talk some about your process as filmmakers and how you came across the story, but I'd like to first start by learning a little bit about both of you, where you're based and where you're from, and just a little bit about your background as storytellers. So Meg or Lauren, Rachel, go first.
Sure. Well, hi, everyone. Again, thank you for having us. And I know after that film, I feel like we always just need this sort of collective deep breath. It's a really emotional journey. So thank you for watching it and being here with us. My filmmaking journey, I think, started in high school. I saw a couple documentaries that really opened up my eyes to the power of storytelling and film. But in college, I ended up studying international development, and I graduated in 2010 from Harvard and moved to Nairobi and was working in international development, but ended up kind of always being interested in filmmaking and trying to figure out, how do I make documentaries as like my side hustle. Essentially, I didn't have a training for it or necessarily the time. And in 2018, I ended up quitting my job. I actually made a documentary right after quitting in Louisiana about AJ Andrews, who was one of your star softball players. She was the first woman to win something called a Rawlings Gold Glove that was given to the best fielders in Major League Baseball for decades. So it's a long story, wrap it up, but basically ended up going to UC Berkeley for journalism school to figure out how can I keep making documentaries with that training, with the journalistic training as well, and connect with people like Rachel so that we can do this great work together.
Is that where the two of you met then, at UC Berkeley?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
All right. So Rachel, yeah, I'd love to know a little more about you.
Yeah, I grew up in a tiny little town in Colorado, so I really identify as a rural kid. So doing this story in rural Louisiana felt very much, rural Louisiana, rural Colorado are not very similar, but I think small town life has very much impacted my identity as I've gotten older. And I've always been really invested in storytelling, and I think connecting with folks that have different lived experiences than myself. In college, I studied anthropology and specifically ethnography. And the idea behind that was really a deep desire to understand what motivates people to make the decisions that they make, and a systems level look at how things operate culturally. And that could mean, within a family culture, or it could mean within an institution, it could mean within, a racial category or an entire country. But so that has been, I think, a deep driving desire for me. For a while, I worked in immigrant storytelling. So I was a program manager for an immigrant nonprofit that did various kinds of storytelling, but really felt compelled to go to and follow journalism because of the desire to seek a sense of truth. I think there's a lot of media that we get that is really trying to convince you of a certain mindset. And I feel like the value of really good journalism is that it presents you with a lot of information and hopefully allows you to make a determination with what to do with that information for yourself in the end. So I went to UC Berkeley and filmmaking. I'm a cinematographer also. So I think the visual language is a really important place for me to express myself, and nonfiction filmmaking felt like a great place. So I was so glad to meet Meg and to have worked on this together with her.
That's great. And you are the director of photography on this film as well, correct?
I was, yeah.
Yeah, it's beautifully shot, just
Thank
really
you.
nicely done. So neither of you are from Louisiana, though Meg, it sounds like you've spent some time here on your prior films. So so I'd really like to know, how did you discover this story?
Sure. I was actually reporting on a different story related to the juvenile justice system when I learned about the deaths of Solon Peterson and Jordan Bachman. And it was one of those moments where I was just struck by the tragedy of it, and also just like the disbelief that something like this could happen, and could happen in the way that it did, just with such a short window of time in the custody of this detention center, where there were just such simple things, I think, that could have been done, and you sort of see in the film that could have been done to keep them safe. And so that was just one of those moments where I don't think I looked left or right or backwards. It was just, okay, how do we do this? And fortunately, Solon's grandmother was really eager to talk to journalists to share his story. And so we talked on the phone, and she ended up driving down from Shreveport to New Orleans with a big framed photo of Solon to meet and to share, why she thought this story needed to be told. And Rachel came with me to that meeting, and it was just, again, abundantly clear, like, let's tell this story. Let's figure out what happened. How could this happen? And I think that was then the impetus for like what turned into a much longer and broader project than just this story about Solon.
And so did you start your filmmaking right after this happened? Was it pretty close to that time in 2019?
It was probably 6 months later.
Okay. And I'm curious how long it took you to complete the film.
Yeah, so we were a part of UC Berkeley's graduate program at the time, and had a year, or I should say a school year, so 9 months to complete the film. So we started, I think we had that meeting with Solon's grandmother in early September or late August, and then we're finished with the film by the end of May. We've made a few tweaks to the film since then. But largely the film has remained the same since that time. And that was really just the constraints of our graduate program. Though I will say, having those kinds of boundaries gives you a pretty clear vision about like, what is it that you need to accomplish? And I don't know how different the film would have been had we had a lot longer.
Yeah. 9 months is not very long. It's definitely not a full year. So you had some geographical, I guess, challenges, just the fact that you weren't based here to be making this. I'm curious what other challenges you faced while producing this. That's a big open question, and I'll let either of you jump in.
I think, we pretty quickly we're starting to hear stories about Ware Youth Center and about some of the abuses that young people had experienced there. I had actually heard about Ware in my other reporting, there were a lot of rumors, but I had never been able to talk to someone who had experienced abuse. And at the point when we decided to do this film, and then I think finding people was like an initial challenge, using records requests, using social media, connecting with people who had been at Ware. But I think then what became a challenge in terms of medium is that at some point it sort of snowballed, and every couple of days I was getting a phone call from someone who had been held at Ware, wanting to share their story, wanting to tell what had happened. And this was all on the phone. And so, and all things that had happened in the past. So I think as filmmakers, we sort of struggled with this challenge around how do we translate that, and ended up deciding to do sort of a parallel print article that we published with the New York Times. But I think sort of in tandem with that, we're hearing all of these stories and we're trying to back them up. I think one of the other challenges is that Ware itself controls a lot of the information about what goes on there. And for good reason, these facilities, they're keeping the privacy of kids safe in terms of like their incarceration, but then it becomes really difficult to know what goes on in a juvenile detention center. And Ware has been cited time after time for either not reporting abuse or sort of disguising what had happened. I think there was one example in our article where they describe something as like the guard subdued a child with like their hand around the child's neck area. They use that language, which then actually DCFS wrote in their report, like the child was choked. And so that's just an example of how Ware used language. And so as filmmakers looking at this material, it's like, how do we figure out what's happening? How do we translate it into our different mediums? And I think those were a couple of the challenges we faced.
Rachel, anything to add?
I don't think so. I think Meg covered it.
Okay. Well, Meg, you mentioned the article, and I'm not sure if our audience knows this. So in October 2022, the two of you wrote basically a companion piece to the film that was published in the New York Times, and it expanded upon and kind of went into more depth than the film does into some of the encounters that you were hearing from people. So I'd love for you to tell me a little bit more about that article and then what the response was.
Yeah, so we finished the film, as Meg was describing. In the process of making the film, we were reaching out to a lot of people. We ended up speaking with over 100 former staff members and former young people who were held at the facility, and just learned about the founding of the facility and how it started, and then these kinds of decades of abuses that were happening at the facility. There was a lot of sexual abuse specifically that we learned about. There were over 30 children that said that they were sexually abused at the facility by, and I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but by over 25 staff members over time, some of whom, as far as we know, still work there. That was kind of a big revelation. The other big revelation that we talk about in the article is that the rate of suicide attempts that was happening at this facility was higher than any other juvenile facility in the state of Louisiana from 2019 to 2021. So I think that I have the dates right on that. And that was really alarming. And so when we published the article, we worked on the article for about, well, it was almost 3 years that we were spent reporting and writing and working with the New York Times on that. And it came out, and the Governor John Bel Edwards of Louisiana had a response to that and said, let's have an investigation into this facility. So we know that happened. Meg and I continued reporting after that announcement was made. And I think like what we know, so this was in October 2022, we did reporting. We found that a lot of the same abuses that we chronicled in the first piece have continued as far as we know up until the present moment. Some of the same staff members, some different staff members. Yeah, I think that's all. Stop there. I don't know if you have other things to add, Meg.
Sorry, I was on mute. I think that's great. A great summary. Not great that the abuse is still happening. I would say in terms of the investigation, we know that it was launched, but we don't know really much about it yet, if it's ongoing or what the findings were. But we're really interested to see what comes of it.
Okay, yeah. So you have not really been given any information into that or insight?
Not yet.
Okay. So I want to bring into this conversation now two other panelists. The first is the Secretary of the Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, and that's Ms. Terri Ricks. And Secretary Ricks, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'd also like to welcome the Co-Executive Director of the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights, Ms. Kristen Rome. And Ms. Rome, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you.
So, this is a sensitive conversation. It's challenging. It's painful, frankly, to think of children suffering these abuses. And I think everyone in this conversation cares about children. So that's why everyone is involved in this work. So I just want to sort of acknowledge that before we dive into some things that are difficult. Secretary Ricks, one of the questions I have for you is really to more fully explain the role of DCFS in the juvenile justice system. Can you explain what oversight DCFS plays with Ware and with other youth detention facilities in Louisiana?
Thank you, Linda. Before I dig into the question, I just wanted to congratulate Meg and Rachel on doing a great job storytelling. I think this is important, and the reason why I wanted to be here is because I think we all need to be, working together and talking together and learning from whatever we have to learn from. And so happy to be able to talk about in this segment of what the Department of Children and Family Services does is a licensing component. So it's basically, I think Meg, or even in the at some point in the video, it talks about there is a set of standards that we go in and determine whether or not the facilities are meeting the minimum standards. Those standards are created by a group of people, juvenile detention experts. We had people, I understand I wasn't here when they were created, but of course they are also created. There's a space for the public to be involved in that. And then in 2019, there was a task force that was created that included a lot of different people to address those standards. And there was some changes. There was a law that came out at that point. And so our part, we are in those discussions. We work with juvenile judges on every other month. We meet with juvenile judges, mostly for child welfare related events, child support enforcement, but then also if there's something that we need to address, we're constantly seeing children in foster care and then potentially going into the juvenile justice system. So, but in the licensing space, we are there to take those minimum standards and ensure that they are being met. And so we create reports. We take reports from the facilities during the time when they self-report, and the regulations do require a fair amount of self-reporting on those minimum standards, and then we're to follow up on them. So we have, lots of language about when we have to go in, when the facility has to report things to us. Sometimes the facilities have to report things to law enforcement as opposed to the department, or in addition to. And so we can talk about that as much as you want, but that's part of like a little line about what we do with regard to the facilities.
And so Ware have they been compliant with that licensing process? It looked like in the film there were some changes that were made after in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious what their kind of how that works with them.
Well, like all facilities, when we go in, if we find that there are deficiencies, we write them up. And then, or they will let us know that something went wrong, and then they'll usually have an opportunity to correct them unless they've shown themselves to be egregiously not following, not wanting to follow, not adhering. And so we always have the ability to take a license if a license needs to be taken. It can be revoked. And they obviously have an opportunity to appeal that decision. We've not revoked. I've looked at the record. We started actually doing the licensing in 2013. So there are a few things in the film that were there's a few things that were before we started licensing. But one way or the other, there usually is an opportunity to cure certain things. And then we'll go back out and see if minimum standards are still being upheld.
Okay. Ms. Rome, I want to bring you into this conversation. I'm wondering, is the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights also involved in these conversations about what minimum requirements are and standards? And then I'm wondering, the film noted that in 2019, Solon's Law was passed, as a means of addressing at least some of these issues. Can you tell us more about that law as well?
Sure. So, from LCCR's perspective, in addition to our direct representation of children in the criminal legal system and the juvenile legal system, we do policy and advocacy work. So we're always happy to be a part of these conversations and always welcome the opportunity to talk to all types of folks, whether it be a specific government entity or whether it be private citizens or coalitions, about detention and about what we know about what detention does to children, about alternatives to detention, and what we know happens when a child is detained and the risks that we take on when a child is detained. And so knowing that risk, how very intentional and thoughtful we have to be when we decide to detain a child. We have to recognize how critical it is and in the heightened risk for the child. And we have to weigh that, and we have to really, really, really be thoughtful and make sure that when we are detaining children, it is the least restrictive means, and there is nothing else that can be done to not only protect the community, but more importantly, protect that child who is going to re-enter our communities at some point. Which is kind of what Solin's Law does, and Solin's Law was passed so that there is a mechanism that allows judges to do a review process and do a screening of a child to weigh a child's risks and a child's needs before deciding whether or not a child should actually be detained. I think the unfortunate part that, we have to acknowledge and talk about is that judges aren't always following and doing what needs to be done to ensure that the screening is done properly and ensure that children who are high risk aren't actually being detained. In certain areas, we're seeing judges routinely do these overrides. So these risk overrides, if, for example, a car is involved, because car crimes are a big deal right now all over the country.
Right,
and
sure.
so if cars are involved, we see judges doing a bit of an override, and that takes into consideration, or that is with just full consideration of what the public wants to do and less of a consideration of what is right for the child and what helps to ensure that the child is well, which then ensures that our communities are well and safe, and promotes community safety, as opposed to just reacting to what may be the issue of the day or the issue of the week or the month. But yeah, we are always happy to be a part of these conversations and grateful to be able to be a part of these conversations, because as the juvenile public defender in New Orleans and as an advocacy group that does this work all over the state, we are really in close contact with the young people and their families. And so we are hearing firsthand what's happening in the facilities. So yeah, always grateful to be a part of these conversations.
And so as the juvenile public defender in New Orleans, you represent, I hope this is correct, 90% or so of the children in New Orleans who enter into the system. I'm wondering, how would you describe Louisiana's juvenile justice system overall?
It's tough, right? I think we have a lot of work to do. Across the country, juvenile justice systems were created for the purpose of rehabilitation. They are not created for the purpose of punishing children, but particularly in Louisiana, the purpose of our system is to rehabilitate children, to assess what their needs are, and to help them become better so that they can re-enter our communities. When a child enters the juvenile justice system in Louisiana, even if they are placed into a youth prison, or what in Louisiana we call secure care facilities, the goal is for them to re-enter society. They are going to re-enter our society. And because they have to re-enter our communities, the purpose of them being detained is only to make them well, so that they can seamlessly enter our communities and thrive in our communities. And I think that in Louisiana, what is happening is far too often we are taking the punishment approach in juvenile justice. And so instead of using our resources and our tools to really get to the heart of the issues with children who commit harms and seeing what the root causes are. We are instead addressing the symptoms and punishing the symptoms. And so as a system, I think we have a very far way to go to get to a place where we are making children whole in a way that can allow them to thrive in our communities, and moving away from just punishing children, but really learning how to meet children where they are, assess their needs, and help their needs to be addressed in a way that heal them, and prioritize healing over punishment in an effort to make our communities whole again.
You know, I will tell you, I have a daughter who is 13 who's still on this age. And so that was one of the things that really was hard for me, because I was looking at him and just thinking about what I know about 13-year-olds. And really, there's so much fragility there and vulnerability, and they're children. I mean, they're literally children, right? Yeah, so it's difficult to think of a child in a situation where they are just not being cared for well, or in many instances, what's come up is outright abuse that is happening. So Secretary Ricks, I'm going to ask this question because Solon's mom says this at the end, and I know a lot of people in our audience are going to be wondering this. And she makes the statement very strongly that Ware should be shut down. And so I want to know, is that possible? What would that entail? What would that look like? Can Ware be shut down?
Certainly, any facility that is egregiously going against the regulations can be shut down. Ware was actually created by a law. The law could shut it down. I think the most important thing, and I feel like what we're all basically saying, though, is that the systems that make up care for children and families and communities, we really need to move to a place where Solon would never be there, right? And so the taken into consideration the things that Kristen talked about, we need to move to being a trauma-informed community. We need trauma-informed schools. We need trauma-informed parents. You know, we need a trauma-informed system for not just education, but also child welfare. The judges, the courts, everyone who's in our community needs to understand what it looks like when someone isn't well and where to find assistance and help. And we're fortunate in Louisiana in that we do have expanded Medicaid, for example. Many children in Louisiana have Medicaid coverage. And there are some services that come with Medicaid that I think a lot of us are not aware of, and they include behavioral health services. And I think we've got to figure out how to increase the number of providers that are providing health and behavioral health care, parenting assistance, and those types of things. But of course, any facility that's open can be closed. I think if we're looking for licensing infractions to be the way that it gets shut down, we'd have to be looking at something that is egregious, that we all agree is completely against, you know, what we were there for. I think what we want to do is to create a Louisiana that doesn't use juvenile detention centers, that we're catching the needs before that. That's not where we are. I think Kristen painted a great picture of what it should be when someone gets there, and we're a long way from that. But we have people like Kristen, and we have other people like, I've sat down and talked with the leader of the Office of Juvenile Justice. I know that there are many people who are advocating for changes, and that this might be one of those ways where more conversations are had to hopefully get to that point. But I'd like to see less and less children there. Unfortunately, today we're actually, needing to consider what are all the systems that end up working against families that could be working for families, and move to a prevention mindset, trauma-informed, understanding what ACEs does, adverse childhood experiences, when we continue to layer the trauma on a child, we're not going to get a better outcome, right? And so it's something that we'll have to continue, working towards. How can we do better when we see children in stress and showing themselves to not be well?
I should point out that we did invite the Office of Juvenile Justice to be part of this conversation, and they declined. And I meant to say that actually earlier when we started. So Meg and Rachel, I want to bring you guys into this conversation as well, because I think we've heard from Secretary Ricks and Ms. Rome some thoughts on juvenile reform and what we would like to see happen. I'm wondering from your perspective, what would you like to see happen after the exposure that you've had to what's happening at Ware?
Well, I would definitely defer to the experts on this panel about like the actual reforms, but I think as someone who spent a lot of time looking at Ware and talking to people who were there and who are still traumatized by that experience, what I would like to see is that no kid ever endures that at any facility, but I know what's happening. I guess I'm talking to people at Ware, so focusing there. I don't want that to continue. I don't want any more kids to die there. I mean, those are some sort of like concrete things as not an expert on juvenile justice, but someone who's sort of paid a visit into this world for the last 3 or 4 years. I know that's not really a concrete reform, but I understand how many systems are at play and in a child ending up there, and I understand the role of licensing being one of the roles. And I just wish I knew, or I wish I saw more from people who did have the ability to keep kids safe there. I guess our film is now out, our article came out, and I haven't felt like anything has changed to keep kids safer. And it's possible that it has, and we haven't learned about it, which is also sort of that curiosity. But I also feel a huge sense of disappointment. I think that now we know. If we didn't know before, now we know.
Yeah, I guess I would say one of the things that we have looked at is the financing of this facility and the amount of money that is put into these different juvenile facilities. And one thing I think that Kristen brought up is, we talk about community, and as Secretary Ricks brought up, community-informed trauma care. And I think about the amount of money that these facilities are getting and the kinds of contracts that they have, and how much better that money might be allocated towards something that is preventative, towards us really investing in families and in communities. And for a facility like Ware Youth Center that is funded both privately, it's also funded by the state of Louisiana. There's a lot of power that the state institutions have in determining how much, very literally how much funding is there. The licensing, if they were to revoke a license, for example, would the Office of Juvenile Justice continue to fund this facility? And where would those funds, could those funds be allocated differently? Again, I think as Meg said, deferring to the experts on folks that are really deeply involved in this. But from a money perspective, I know that when you follow the money, you can really see where a community's values lie and where a system's values lie. And that's one thing that feels pretty clear, is this particular facility is getting a lot of money.
Secretary Ricks, the investigation that Governor John Bel Edwards called for back in 2022 after the New York Times article, what happened with that? I don't know if you're able to share anything that came out of it. Meg shared earlier that they haven't, as filmmakers, heard much about that.
Sure. So my understanding is the previous secretary and the previous secretary of the Office of Juvenile Justice both went to Ware. I will say that what I understand was done was looking at the allegations that were in the article. So it was less about starting off with, let's go investigate Ware, because as a licensing unit, we had been at Ware every time there had been something. All of our regular checks were being done. And so it was very important to us to be able to look at, was there a new piece of information that we didn't have before, that's something to act on that would show that the veracity of the documentation that we had was not right? Was there something wrong? But since the article covered a very, very large period of time, it took quite a bit of time for us to make sure to go back and look at, was there any new information that we had? But a licensing is a point in time decision. And I think it is important to understand that what we're looking at is minimum standards. And you're going in and you're making a determination about minimum standards. And I will say that we participate to understand juvenile justice so we can participate in the discussions about all things related to children. It matters to us. The scope of a licensing unit is to determine whether or not the regs that have been created by a whole bunch of folks are being followed. And when those regs are created, they also give a window of time for someone to make a correction. What is a fatal change to, meaning what is when they're doing something that says that's it, this has to close, that has to be in the regulations, right? Otherwise, the regulations give some the facility an opportunity to correct. So we're using those regs. When you're a regulator, and that's what we are, when we're regulating, you regulate according to standards that are created, not according to feelings, not according to anything else, just the regs. But we participate with others. These are, my understanding is that when these were put into place, they were the gold standard at the time, right? And so all regulations should evolve. Everything that we're doing should evolve. And so the fact that we're having this conversation will likely allow the regulations to evolve. And it's coming though from everybody. It comes from the facilities, it comes from the community, it comes from parents, it comes from, you know, those who are in the system. In the past, everyone has an opportunity to have a voice in the regulation, but once they're there, we're there to determine whether they met it or they did it, and do they have an opportunity to cure it, and whether they're a bad actor or a good actor. And so it's those things. And so everything that we do is a public record. And I think, you know, the filmmakers might be able to talk about that. Like we were trying to show, here's everything, right? Because we are a department that wants to get better. Our subject matter is too important to sit on the side and not get better. But being a regulator, that's a, you know, it's a tiny little thing. And so I get the outrage, I do, but we have to recognize like what the licensing standards are, just the licensing standards, right? Everything else we've been talking about are way bigger than the licensing standards.
I would love to just chime in and say that DCFS was incredibly helpful to us as an agency in terms of providing records for us, at least up until our article was published. I think we maybe hit a little bit of a block since then. I know a lot's been going on in the agency, but that was like a huge asset and really different from other agencies we worked with. And I just want to thank you, Secretary Ricks, for that. I think it was really helpful for everyone to be able to have that information.
Rachel, Ms. Rome, I'm wondering that either of you have anything that you want to add to this conversation about regulations, which I think is interesting, that maybe a possible outcome of this could be revisiting of what those minimum requirements are and raising those.
And we're in them now, right? Just so you know that times change, things change when we learn things, right? So I know that our licensing unit is in the process of reviewing the regs now. So it is a place where people have an opportunity to determine like what goes in the regs. And I'm an attorney too, right? So words, they are very important, but when they say what they say, and they also, you know, if it doesn't say it, it doesn't say it, right? So it's important that people that are interested you know, really dig deep with it, right, and follow it through to determine whether or not, you know, because one word really can make a difference when it comes to things like that.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I would just like to add, and so I think in the process of our reporting and research, someone pointed out that it's you can make as many regulations as you want, and people choose whether or not to follow them. And I know what the film shows is, there were plenty of regulations in place that could have kept stolen safe had they been followed correctly. And so when we talk about regulations and the systems in which these facilities are supposed to operate, what becomes really quite important is both the culture that's created within the facility, but then the culture of accountability that is holding these facilities very tightly to these standards that are had. And that really becomes quite essential in the system that you're operating within, because again, you can create as many rules as you want, and whether or not people follow them is a different, it determines things differently. And it was great to see that Solon's Law was passed, another regulation. I hope that has, as Kristen pointed out, whether or not judges are following that, there's a lot of players that influence how these pieces are put into play. But
Rachel, that's a good point. And, so my understanding, and I had recently a conversation so that I could make sure to understand it for this conversation, right? And that is that, this, the assessment that was put in place with the law, that the judges are supposed to do, that law enforcement is supposed to do before it actually transports someone to the facility, that the facility is supposed to make sure happened if it hadn't happened yet, right? And it's something that we would do a check on in, when we're doing a licensing check. And so there are some spaces for some checks and balances. But again, what you're talking about a culture, and I think Kristen did a beautiful job talking about, the road we have left to travel to get where we want to be. But I think the reason why I did accept, being on this panel with you all is I think the conversations have to happen in order for the changes that we want and the culture that we want to grow in Louisiana. For us to have any chance of that happening, we have to have these conversations, and we have to have people that are joining us in thinking through what else could be in the regs, how else could we hold accountability, like you said. But a law is a law, like you said, right? And culture is a lot of other things, right? And so it really takes us all together, just deciding that we're going to love the kids. And recently was looking at this quote by Mother Teresa that says, if you're judging me, you can't love me. And I think, there's a lot of that we have to just kind of get into the trenches of really caring for one another in a way that we may not have been in the past. And that digs into the culture that we're trying to build in Louisiana. I'd love to instead have a culture of my community cares about me. That's what I'd love for everybody in Louisiana to be able to unequivocally say.
And I was just going to add to the regulations piece is that I'm excited and appreciative to hear that these things should be evolving, and that this conversation will get us towards moving these things. And my hope is that as new regulations are created, that we maintain room for humanity within regulations, right? Because we create rules and regulations, and then we make them so tight and in a box that when as human beings, we see that things are not as they should be, there's no space for accountability because the regulations and the rules are just that. And not only are we dealing with human beings, we're dealing with children. And what we have seen in Louisiana historically, what we have been sure of, what we have been given examples of time and time again, is that adults in Louisiana who are in a position to make decisions about children are not responsible and are not caring for children in the way that children need to be cared for. I spent all day today at the Louisiana legislature where a bill to lower the age to 17 was passed through committee, which now will mean if that bill continues and moves forward and we aren't able to kill it, that a 17-year-old will now be tried as an adult automatically, which we just got in alignment with most of the country 2 years ago. And so we're already rolling it back, and potentially will now be one of 4 states that charges 17-year-olds as an adult automatically. And so I'm just using that as an example to show that in Louisiana, far too often children are not treated like children. And so those of us who are here doing the work, who care about children, like those of us here on the call, like Secretary Ricks, and who are actually working for children, when we are doing the work, we have to make sure that we maintain enough integrity inside of the work that folks like us can then maneuver in a way that protects children. Because what is clear is all adults in Louisiana will not be responsible for caring for children.
You know, ironically, there's more, it seems there's more accountability for the children who have erred than there is accountability for the adults who are supposed to be helping them. Yeah, thank you for making that point. I want to talk, before we run out of time, I want to talk about mental health. Because one of the things that was very clear was that Solon was having some struggles with mental health. A lot of people are having struggles with mental health in the past couple of years, and youth in particular are, for a wide variety of reasons. And so I'd like to open up a discussion about how youth mental health factors into some of these issues of helping them, how it factors into some of the misbehaviors and crimes being committed. How does this all weave together?
I can speak, but I'm not a mental health professional, right? I just know that it's super, super important because of the traumas. And who was it? Was it you, Kristen, who was about to start speaking? Because I want to give you back the mic. I just can tell you that what I'm constantly aware of is that the traumas that children are under, they're not just like traumas happening in their household or at their school, but in Louisiana, while the rest of the nation was going through the lockdown from the pandemic, we also had like an innumerable number of named storms, tornadoes, and our community has been wrecked. And if we're not paying attention to the traumas that are happening to the entire state, and especially certain areas that have had multiple traumas from natural disasters, et cetera, I think that this is where I kind of go right back to, like, continue to go back. We've got to understand psychologically what happens to children and their families when there are these multiple traumas, big, that impact the entire community. It has a greater impact than I think we may be attributing to it.
Yeah, totally. And I really appreciate you raising this compounded trauma of like natural disasters, pandemic. That doesn't even take into account many of the other traumas that young people in Louisiana are experiencing, such as extreme poverty and other things of that nature, experiencing domestic violence or drug use and things like that. But I think the other thing that's always important to think about as we are thinking about mental health as it relates to children is that the other huge piece is that we are talking about trauma to an underdeveloped brain, and that children, the normal functioning brain, so this is a brain that is normal, doesn't experience all of this trauma. The normal functioning brain is not fully developed until mid to late 20s. And so when you have a child that is experiencing heightened trauma constantly with an underdeveloped brain, you know, it's even worse. It's compounded time and time again. And so we have to recognize again that like children are different than adults. The way we approach children and everything is different. And even when we're talking about mental health issues, the way we approach children and the way we create solutions for children who are dealing with mental health issues and stressors around mental health is going to be different because their brains are not fully developed. And so the way that they even begin to perceive stress or understand stress or are able to articulate I feel stressed. I feel overwhelmed. I feel sad. Children oftentimes don't have the capacity to recognize what they're feeling. They don't have the capacity to understand that, like, oh, I am just mad in this moment and this will pass. My anger will pass. They don't understand that. Or I am sad in this moment. And when I'm sad, this is how I behave. Children don't have the capacity to recognize that. And unfortunately, many of their caregivers, because of all of the trauma that they have experienced in their own development, they too cannot identify what is happening to their children and what their children are experiencing. And so it gets back to what we talked about earlier about investing resources in community in a way to not only promote community safety, but to help children and their families, right? And so again, we only put children into youth prisons or into detention because we are claiming that the state can do something that their parents are unable to do. And so if the state and the detention facility or the youth prison is not going to do that, we should be investing those resources directly with the parent or the caregiver so that the parent or the caregiver can then provide what the child needs.
If it's okay, I'd just love to jump on that as well, because I think in that context, what Rachel and I found in our reporting is it often took multiple conversations with these young people who endured so much trauma for them to share what had happened to them, and for all kinds of reasons, the fear that they have of consequences of speaking out. And so I think that's one of the reasons, Secretary Ricks, I'm so grateful that you're here and that you're invested in this dialogue, because I think we we've reached out to everyone who we wrote about in our article, and to hear, has anyone come to talk to you? Have investigators who are looking into Ware tried to ask you what happened to you? And we're hearing that they haven't heard from someone. And what we've gotten from public records requests is that there has been a conversation sort of at the highest levels with Ware administrators and the previous secretary of OJJ and DCFS. And I think knowing how hard it is for these young people to speak and like how to create the space for them to feel safe, I think is why we're so invested in understanding like who's really asking them. And if that's not something you can speak to now, I just hope that is a conversation we can continue to have, because when we talk to them, we're hearing that there's still, that multiple of the abuses we wrote about are still happening. And so if that's true, and we believe, the amount we're hearing, we believe it's true, like how do we uncover that if it's not coming out through the current licensing process?
Absolutely.
I think that's something I'm sort of holding.
That's a good question, Meg. And I think, what's important is that there are mechanisms for people to report what they think are happening, or what their experience is. And part of the licensing process is that we will have licensing professionals that do talk to the youth when they're there. And so what I hear you're saying is that, yeah, you might talk to them today, but they might be scared to death to talk to you about what's really going on. And so I think it's important that families that have children in the system are talking to them. And if they need to raise something outside of the licensing process, they can come, to the department, they can go to the police, they can also go to the Office of Inspector General. I mean, there are multiple places where they can go. I mean, I literally field emails from people every day that with allegations, and we have a process for looking at each one of those. And so there's a no wrong door space to be able to say, I want to talk about an allegation. We look at them. Unfortunately, we don't have jurisdiction over everything. And I think it's important for people to know that the way that the law and the regs are written, if there is a crime committed in a facility, we will find out about it, but we don't have the authority to investigate. That is part of actually the law enforcement part. And so this is where it's kind of weird to try to figure it all out, like, what do I go when? But if we do get wind of something that is not under our jurisdiction, so to speak, we do pass it on to law enforcement. Now, Meg, Rachel, in your storytelling, you will find like what happens with law enforcement, right? And so it is a tough spot that, the state of DCFS I don't hold law enforcement accountable. That's not in my structure. I can keep, making sure that we're bringing things up. We can, rattle concerns at certain points, but this is why it's the public that holds us all accountable, like you're saying, right? All of us work for the public. We're public servants. And so in that sense, we're going to have to keep working together to move this way. And I appreciate, Kristen's LCCR, right? That's what they're there for, to provide advocacy outside of the public servants, to help the public, to keep public servants accountable as well, right? And so we just have to we're in this, suspended place where it was made that way, where one helps keep the other accountable. And so I knew that this was not, the glorious job when I took it, but it is an important job. Children are important, and the systems that really we're all talking about today they were not built in fairness and equity in the beginning, right? If we think about that. So this is a journey towards fairness and equity. It will require all of us in our various roles to keep pressing. None of us can do it alone. We absolutely need to do it together, and we need to keep, looking for ways to make people, families in their homes have the facilities and resources that they need to really have wellness in their home and in their communities. And that's going to continue to be my bent. I'm going to keep bending towards how do we get people the resources that they need there. And so, for example, we got into a cooperative endeavor agreement with our Louisiana Association of United Ways for the use of 211, so that when a family is like, I don't know what to do with my child, I need help with parenting, I need resources for mental health, if anybody would pick up the phone and call 211, they'll help you find the resources in your community. And I would say that as the new managed care organizations are in their new Medicaid contracts, that those of us who are covered by Medicaid need to pick up the phone and find out what resources are available to you in Medicaid. There are new resources, and they come with behavioral health packaging and wraparounds that maybe people are not used to. So I'd love to get to a point where we're, making it, avant-garde to all of us have, everybody in a household. I have a mental health professional. I go to the dentist, I go to the OBGYN, I go to my, to the doctor every year, and I have a mental health professional. It's just part of the package, and that we're calling it in when we need it, and we need it for ourselves and for our children.
Secretary Briggs, thank you. I'm glad that you were able to talk about the 211 number as we wrap this up. So that was a good wrapped up comment for you. We only have about 2 minutes left, and we are out of time. And I just want to give Ms. Rome and the filmmakers, I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds apiece. I hope that's okay. But Kristen, my question to you is basically, what do you hope to see happen as a takeaway from this discussion that we've had and from this film being released?
Easy. I hope that we in this state begin to treat children like children. I'll give it to Meg and Rachel. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And Meg and Rachel, this is the first time really that a larger audience has had the privilege of seeing your film. So what are your hopes for the impact that this could have in the future?
Do you want? Okay, I'll go. I just got a text message from Solon's mom, so I just thought I would share that. She wanted to speak. I think hearing Secretary Rick, she felt that it was really difficult to know what was happening with Solon, that parents and families were left in the dark, that the facility didn't allow her to communicate very easily with him. And so I hope that for families, that becomes easier, but also that this film and our article makes it possible for people to have that information, to be engaged, to hold people accountable, policymakers, facilities, pay attention, because anyone's kid could end up there. And knowing that, I hope there's more engagement to make this whole system safer.
And I guess I'll just add, I think something going back to what Kristen was saying, we were talking about these a large shift that needs to happen. And when my background's in cultural work, and I think about culture, and I think about the ways in which we think about community safety in a really comprehensive ways. And I hope that this film and this article really make people think deeply about what are the necessities for a safe community, and how do we allocate resources towards supporting those goals. And that's what I hope people think about.
Thank you both. I want to thank you both for the work that you've done with the film. Obviously, it's really important. Thank you to all of you for being part of this panel this evening. I think we could talk much longer, but I appreciate everyone's vulnerability and willingness to engage with this. And I want to thank Solon's mom, honestly, for her willingness to share her, her deep loss, because my hope and prayer is that there will be changes that come about because of your willingness to share that. So thank you for listening, for being part of this conversation tonight. So thank you all for being here.